All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to get a little dirty, at least in our minds, with the science of composting.
Sounds fun.
We're digging into Chapter 2 of that composting resource. I know you've been looking forward to this.
Yeah.
It really breaks down how composting works, like step by step.
It's pretty amazing stuff, honestly.
Yeah, we're going to be covering the composting process itself, then, of course, all those little microbes and how important they are, and also how the compost heats up and how we can manage that.
The heat is really key.
Definitely. And get this, even if someone listening has zero plans to ever build a compost pile,
Yeah.
understanding this science, it really opens your eyes to this whole hidden world right under our feet.
It's true. I mean, composting is like the secret society of organisms doing all this work we don't even see.
Exactly. So the guide uses this cool phrase, microbial symphony.
I love that.
So it's not just stuff rotting randomly, right? There's like actual phases to this whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. There are distinct phases. And get this, each phase has different types of microorganisms that are like the stars of the show. And of course, each phase has its own temperature range too. It all starts with what we call the mesophilic phase.
Mesophilic.
Temperatures are moderate during this phase. It's where those common bacteria we know and, well, maybe not love, but they're important. They get to work. They break down all the easy stuff first, the sugars and starches. Think of it like the opening act of our symphony.
So like the appetizers before the main course.
Exactly.
So then what happens? Things start heating up.
You got it. As those bacteria are munching away, they generate heat. So the temperature rises and we move into the thermophilic phase.
Ooh, thermophilic.
Yeah, things get hot here. This is where the real heavy lifting happens, breaking down tougher materials like cellulose and proteins.
Okay, so that intense heat, is it just a side effect or does it have a purpose?
Oh, it's definitely not just a side effect. It's crucial. First of all, it really speeds up decomposition so the microbes can work faster. Second, those high temperatures, we're talking 131 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Whoa, that's hot.
It acts like a natural sterilization system. Kills off those harmful pathogens and weed seeds.
So it's like nature's way of making sure the final product is super clean and beneficial, huh?
Exactly. Safe and beneficial for your garden. It's amazing how nature takes care of things.
That's so cool. Okay, so this has happened to me. Sometimes my compost pile, it doesn't seem to be heating up.
Happens to the best of us.
What am I doing wrong?
This is where understanding the science comes in handy. It helps you troubleshoot those problems. So if your compost isn't heating up, it could be a few things. Maybe the mix of materials isn't quite right.
Okay, yeah, the guy does mention browns and greens.
We'll definitely dive into that more later. Or it could be that it's not getting enough air. Remember, those microbes need oxygen to do their thing.
They need to breathe.
Exactly. So it's like being a compost detective. Got to figure out what those microbes need.
I love that. Okay, so let's talk about those microbes a bit more. The guide mentions all this diversity. It's amazing. We've got bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi.
Don't forget protozoa.
Oh, right, protozoa too. It's like a whole ecosystem in there.
It truly is. And just like any ecosystem, every player has a role. Bacteria, they're the workhorses, right? Breaking down most of the material and creating that essential heat. But as the compost matures, it cools down a bit. And that's when the actinomycetes step in.
Actinomycetes.
They're specialists at breaking down the really tough stuff like lignin. That's what gives wood its strength. And guess what?
Wow.
They're the reason that finished compost has that classic earthy smell.
Ooh, I love that smell.
Me too. It's like the smell of healthy soil, full of life.
And what about fungi? What's their role?
Fungi are amazing. They can thrive in conditions that even bacteria find challenging, like super acidic environments. They also help break down those tough materials and contribute to that beautiful, rich structure we want in our finished compost.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. So understanding all these different types of microbes and what they need to survive, that's how we can create the best environment for them, right?
Absolutely. It's all about balance. Providing the right mix of greens and browns, like we mentioned earlier, along with enough moisture and oxygen, you're basically creating the perfect recipe for microbial success.
So we got to get that recipe just right. Okay, remind me again, what was that ideal temperature range?
131 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the sweet spot for decomposition.
Okay, 131 to 160. How do we get it to that temperature?
Well, remember those microbes we talked about? They're like tiny little engines, and they need fuel to run.
Right.
That fuel comes from the browns and greens. The greens, like your kitchen scraps and grass clippings, they're packed with nitrogen. And the browns, like dry leaves and shredded paper, they're rich in carbon.
Carbon and nitrogen, got it.
Getting that ratio of carbon to nitrogen right, that's the key to hitting those optimal temperatures.
Makes sense. But how do we figure that out practically? Do we need to, like, weigh everything?
No, you don't need to be a chemist to compost. A good rule of thumb is 2 to 3 parts browns to 1 part greens by volume. And, keep an eye on the moisture. It should feel like a wrung-out sponge. Not too wet, not too dry.
Okay, wrung-out sponge. Got it. That's a good visual. So we have our browns and greens all sorted. But the guide also mentions a bunch of things we should avoid putting in the compost.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some things that can mess with the composting process or, invite some unwanted guests to the party.
Like what?
Things like meat, dairy, cooked foods. They decompose too slowly and can create some pretty funky smells that attract rodents. It's best to avoid those.
Makes sense. What about diseased plants? Should we avoid those?
Yeah, it's best to avoid diseased plants. You don't want to risk spreading those diseases to your healthy plants when you use the finished compost in your garden.
Makes sense. And of course, no pet waste or synthetic materials, right?
Definitely not.
Okay, so we've got our materials all sorted. What's next? Do we just toss everything into a big pile and let nature do its thing?
You could, but there are definitely more efficient ways to compost. The guide mentions a few different composting systems, like simple backyard bins and even those fancy tumbler composters.
Yeah, the tumblers. Have you ever tried one of those?
I have, yeah.
What do you think?
They're really great, especially if you're looking for speed. They make aerating the compost super easy.
Oh, right, because you just rotate the drum.
Exactly. Keeps everything mixed up and oxygenated, which helps speed up decomposition.
Makes sense.
Plus, they're usually enclosed, so that keeps pests out.
Oh, that's a good point.
And they're great if you don't have a ton of space.
Yeah, space is always an issue for me. So the tumblers are good for that. But what about those traditional compost bins? Are those still a good option?
Oh, for sure. They might require a little more elbow grease, turning the compost manually to get that air in there.
Yeah, got to get those muscles working.
But they can handle larger volumes of material, which is great if you have a lot of yard waste.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And some people just prefer that hands-on approach, right?
Absolutely. It's all about what works best for you.
Right. Then there's vermicomposting, using worms to do the work.
Oh, yeah.
I've always been a little intimidated by that, but also intrigued.
It's amazing. It might sound a little strange, but it's actually super efficient and odorless. Perfect even if you want to compost indoors.
Oh, wow. Indoors. Okay.
I'm listening. Red wiggler worms? Yeah. They're the composting superstars?
They are.
Yeah. They just eat and eat and eat. They can process so much organic waste. It's incredible.
So there are lots of different options depending on what you need and what you like.
Definitely. And once you pick your system, the key is to maintain those ideal conditions we talked about, the right mix of materials, moisture, aeration.
Right, like creating that perfect habitat for those microbes.
Exactly. It's like you're building a tiny city just for them.
And we're the city planners. I love that analogy. Okay, so the guide also mentions that the location of the compost bin matters.
Oh, yeah. Location is important.
How so?
Well, you want a spot that's easy for you to get to, of course. But you also want a spot that gets a good mix of sun and shade.
Okay, why is that?
Too much sun will dry the compost out, but too much shade can slow down decomposition. It's all about balance.
Makes sense. And probably best to keep it away from trees and shrubs too, right?
Good thinking.
Yeah.
You don't want their roots growing into your compost and stealing all those good nutrients.
Definitely not.
And of course, be mindful of your neighbors. A well-managed compost pile shouldn't smell bad,
Right.
but it's still good manners to keep it a reasonable distance from their property line.
Good point. So many things to consider. Composting is really a mix of science, practicality, and even social awareness.
It really is. Like we've seen, there are so many different methods and systems. It's all about finding the one that works for you and that you can stick with, turning those kitchen scraps and yard waste into something amazing for your garden.
Speaking of which, how do we know when it's ready? When can we actually harvest it and use it?
That's a great question and a perfect way to transition to the next part of our deep dive. We're going to talk about all the signs of finished compost, how to harvest it properly, and how to use it effectively in your garden.
Awesome. I can't wait. This has been so insightful already. I'm looking at my compost pile in a whole new light. But before we get lost in the world of microbes, let's take a quick break and let our listeners absorb all this amazing information.
Sounds good. We'll be back soon to explore even more about how to put this composting science into action.
All right, welcome back. Ready to get a little more practical with all this composting knowledge? Absolutely. I'm itching to get my hands dirty, metaphorically, of course, and put the science to work.
Well, let's start with those browns and greens. They're more than just catchy names, you know. They're really the bread and butter of composting.
Yeah, the fuel for the whole process. So to recap, browns are those carbon-rich materials, like dry leaves, shredded paper, things like that. And greens are the nitrogen-rich stuff, kitchen scraps, grass clippings.
Right. And getting that balance right is super important. Too much nitrogen, things can get a bit stinky and soggy too. Too much carbon, and decomposition just slows to a crawl.
Yeah, the guide mentioned that ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio. What was it again?
Aim for somewhere between 25.1 and 30.1.
Okay, 25 to 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. But how do we figure that out in real life? Do we need to break out the scales and weigh everything?
Haha, no, you don't need to be a chemist to make good compost. A good rule of thumb is about 2 to 3 parts browns to 1 part greens by volume. Just eyeball it and, pay attention to how moist it is. Remember, like a wrung out sponge.
Yeah, wrung out sponge, got it. Okay, so we've got our browns and greens all sorted, but the guide also had this pretty long list of things we shouldn't put in our compost. What are the big no-nos?
Well, some things can really mess with the whole composting process or even attract some unwanted visitors,
Oh, like raccoons going through the compost bin.
Exactly. So things like meat scraps, dairy, cooked food, it's best to avoid those. They break down really slowly and, yeah, they can get pretty stinky, which is like a beacon for rodents.
Yeah, no one wants that. What about diseased plants? Should those go in the compost?
It's best to err on the side of caution with those. You don't want to risk spreading those diseases to your healthy plants when you use the compost later on.
Makes sense. And obviously, no pet waste or synthetic materials, right?
Right. Those are definitely off limits. Okay, so we've got our materials figured out. What's next? Do we just toss everything in a big pile?
Yeah, is that it? Just let nature do its thing?
Well, you could, but there are more efficient ways to go about it. Remember, the guide talked about different composting systems. We've got the simple backyard bins, but there are also those tumbler composters.
Yeah, the tumblers. Those seem pretty cool. Have you ever used one?
I have. They're really great, especially if you're looking for speed. They make aeration so much easier.
Did you just turn the drum, right?
Exactly. It keeps everything mixed up really well, and it gets plenty of oxygen, which speeds up decomposition.
Makes sense. And those tumblers are usually enclosed too, right?
Yep, which helps keep those pesky critters out.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
And they're good for people with limited space too.
Definitely. But what about those traditional compost bins? Are those still a good option?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of the classic composting method.
Absolutely. They might require a little more effort, you'll have to turn the compost manually to get that air in there.
A little bit of a workout.
Yeah, but they can handle larger volumes of material, which is great if you have a lot of yard waste to compost. And, some people just like that more hands-on approach. It's all about personal preference.
True. Then there's vermicomposting. That's using worms, right?
Oh, yeah. Worms are composting champs.
I've always been a little intimidated by that method, but also kind of fascinated.
It's pretty amazing. It might sound a little unusual, but it's actually super efficient. And it's odorless, which is a big plus. You can even do it indoors if you want to.
Right, indoors. Really?
Yeah. Red wiggler worms are the stars of the show. They're a voracious eater. You'd be amazed how much they can handle.
So, lots of different options to choose from.
Definitely. And once you've picked your system, the key is to maintain those ideal conditions we've been talking about. The right mix of materials, the right moisture level, good aeration.
Right, creating that perfect little microbial haven.
Exactly. It's like you're building a tiny city for those microbes. And we're the city planners, making sure everything runs smoothly.
I love that analogy. Okay, so the guide also mentioned that where you put your compost bin actually matters.
Oh, yeah. Location is important.
In what way?
Well, first, you want it to be convenient for you. You'll be going back and forth to it a lot. But also, you want to find a spot that gets a good mix of sun and shade.
Why is that?
Too much sun will dry out the compost too quickly, and too much shade can slow down decomposition. It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing it's best to keep it away from trees and shrubs, right? So their roots don't grow into the compost.
Exactly. You don't want them stealing all those nutrients.
Definitely not. They can find their own food.
Haha, exactly. And it's also good to be mindful of your neighbors. A well-managed compost shouldn't smell bad, but it's still courteous to put it a reasonable distance from their property line.
That's a good point. So, as with most things in life, composting requires balance,
Yeah.
right?
It does. It's a mix of science, practicality, and even social awareness. But like we've seen, there are so many different methods and systems out there. It's all about finding what works for you and your lifestyle. The goal is to turn those kitchen scraps and yard waste into this amazing resource for your garden. Speaking of that resource, how do we know when the compost is actually ready to use? When can we harvest it?
That's a great question. And it's the perfect segue to our final part of this deep dive. We'll talk about all the signs of finished compost, how to harvest it properly, and of course, how to use it effectively in your garden.
Perfect. I can't wait. This has been so insightful already. I'm looking at my compost pile with a whole new level of respect.
It's amazing what's happening in there, right?
Absolutely. So much going on beneath the surface. Well, stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back soon to uncover the final secrets of composting mastery. And we're back. Okay, we've learned about the science behind composting, all the different methods, and now the moment of truth. How do we harvest and actually use this amazing compost we've created? I feel like we're about to unearth some buried treasure. You know what? That's a great way to put it. But before you grab your shovel and start digging, let's talk about how to know when your compost is truly ready to use.
Okay, so I can't just scoop up any old pile of, decomposing stuff and call it compost, right?
Right. Finished compost has a very specific look and feel. It should be dark and crumbly, almost like rich topsoil. And all those materials you originally added, you shouldn't even be able to recognize them anymore. They should be broken down into this uniform, earthy substance. And of course...
Should have that amazing earthy smell.
Exactly. That's the sign of success. Now, if you happen to see some bigger chunks that haven't quite broken down all the way...
Yeah, what do we do about that?
That's where sifting comes in. You can use a compost sieve or even just a screen to separate those larger pieces from the finished compost. Don't worry, those unfinished bits can go right back into your compost pile or bin. Give them a little more time to break down.
So we're basically giving our compost a little quality control check, making sure everything's perfectly broken down. Okay, so now we have this beautiful finished compost. What's the best way to use it?
Well, the guide you shared mentions a few different applications. Amending your soil, top dressing, even using it as mulch.
I've definitely experimented with compost in my garden before.
Yeah.
But I'm always looking for tips. What are the best ways to use it?
I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve in your garden and, what kind of soil you're working with. If you're starting a brand new garden bed, adding a good layer of compost like 3 to 4 inches can really make a difference. It improves soil fertility and structure, gives your plants a great foundation to grow.
So we're basically rolling out the red carpet for those plants with a nice layer of nutrient-rich compost. What about for established garden beds?
For those, a yearly top dressing of 1 to 2 inches of compost can work wonders. It helps maintain the soil health, keeps those nutrients replenished for your plants.
Okay, makes sense. And the guide also mentioned using compost as mulch. Is that something you recommend?
Oh, absolutely. Applying a layer of compost around your plants, it's like giving them a cozy blanket.
I like that.
It helps conserve moisture, suppress those pesky weeds, and it can even regulate the soil temperature, which is especially important for those delicate plant roots.
So it's like a multi-purpose gardening superhero. Compost is amazing. Are there any things we should watch out for when using compost? Any precautions?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that even though compost is super beneficial, you don't want to overdo it. Too much of a good thing,
Right.
Too much compost can actually lead to nutrient imbalances in the soil, which can be harmful to your plants. So, like with most things in life, moderation is key. Pay attention to how your plants are responding and adjust accordingly. And remember, composting is a cycle.
From kitchen scraps to garden gold and back again. It's amazing.
It really is. Composting reminds us how connected we are to these natural processes. It shows us how nature recycles and renews itself. And by understanding the science of composting, we can not only help our gardens thrive, but also play a part in creating a more sustainable world.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the science, get your hands a little dirty, and experience the magic of composting for yourselves.
You won't regret it. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the wonders all around us.